Evet, herkese merhaba.
Welcome all. First of all, I would like to welcome you to our last session. We will talk about science fiction today. We have very distinguished guests. We are together with all these guests. First of all, I would like to talk about the initial part of that. We started in 2016 with Other Worlds. It was a lecture called Other Worlds, and we picked some issues, some topics, and we will also hear your comments, your critics about this session. I am from Istanbul Technical University. Ervin, with Ervin, we worked in science fiction literature, and we also established a lecture in a university, and we renovated the content with different writers, with different scientific scientists. And the reason that we are today is we have different guests that have studied these lectures. So we will talk about these lectures. We will make comments on them. It's our pleasure to be in this platform in order to make a debate. So after this introduction, I will give the floor to Ervin, and welcome again. So, MARUF within an urban library, we will talk about the urban library and science fiction. It will not be only literature. We will talk about within a very broad perspective, because we will talk about cinema, movies, and we will also talk about the fiction and the fiction perspective. Fatma, Cihan, Akkartal is our guest. She is a movie writer. If you Google her, she's associated with thriller literature, thriller cinema, thriller movies. And also she is a translator. She has all craft translations and different literature of science fiction. You can also find her writings in WordPress. Thank you very much. And Cihan Kantarcı is author, editor, translator, and he has translated one of the most important literature from Frankenstein. And another one is American Town and Grotesque, Watchmen, one of them, and also other books. He is a science fiction translator. A movie also was screened in different places of the world. He is editor of science fiction in İDÜK, in Istanbul, in science fiction, and in 2020 August he published the Eyes, or another book called The Shadow Above. So it's a science fiction book. So I would like to welcome you all. I want to start with Cihan. We will start with him. So when we say science fiction and urban areas and cities, we think about some literature masterpieces. They are associated with space, and also urban places, urban spaces. They are very attached to each other. So how would you like to start science fiction and cities? when we call them, when we think about them, we have to think about the very initial part of urban and science fiction. We have the modern cities, starting from the 19th century, the second part of the 19th century with the Industrial Revolution, with developments. We have seen a very important impact, socio-economically speaking, a huge impact on cities. And science fiction was developing in these centuries. So it is about the scientific developments and also its impact on individuals. And this type of literature was impacted by the cities. Of course, they were interlinked because there was a city life, and most of the science fiction they all happen in the city places. There are very limited stories, thrilling stories, science fiction stories occurring in rural areas. So we know that most of them they are in urban areas. In movies, in the cinema, we know that from the very first stages we have seen science fiction movies with the modernity, with the urban development, and also the place of movies, cinema in the cities is very widening our perspective. So in cinema, we can see one of the first important examples. So it's a massive art, and it has a huge impact on people from the beginning of the 20th century. The people, they were socializing in the cinema. In the cinema places, for example, the workers, they were socializing in these places. And I can also say radically, perhaps, this is my own view, maybe the first function of cinema was socializing of workers living in the cities, in the urban areas, from different ages, from different backgrounds, because they were living in very bad conditions. So these people gathered, and in cinema salons, they got together. They were watching a screen, and it was a kind of entertainment for them. So it had that kind of a function during the first phase of this type. And science fiction cinema, it is a kind of entertainment, and it occurs in the heart of the cities. And in literature, in, for example, novels, we can also see its link with the cities if we get out of the science fiction movies. Maybe John has a lot to say in this matter. So approach is very important in science fiction writing. So you have to go back. You like going back and labeling the concepts. Nobody wanted to label these literatures as science fiction. From 12th century, we have some examples. Nobody labeled them as science fiction. So at some point there has been an acceleration, so we named them as science fiction. And for example, The Shadow Above Us was not an attempt to make a science fiction, but it was a label that we got afterwards. The link between the novel and science fiction should be considered in this concept. For example, Don Quixote from Cervantes or other writings are important, but from the modern novels we have Robinson Crusoe, both Landers, for example, it's a good example. They have some common points in 18th century, as Cihan mentioned. At the first part of the 18th century, the people had some spare time, some free time. We also had some brochures of Jonathan Swift, and they needed to read some longer stories. Because we had some actors after the feudal era. Now we have an enlightenment. The individual is very important, and science fiction takes us to a different place. Yeah, we have individual stories, but now we also had some other events out of it. For example, Frankenstein. It's a good example. It's one of the first examples of science fiction. It starts in the city. The story starts in the city. There is a creation in the city, but the real story is in the nature. It is about the transformation. It's about it's about the bigness. It's about the glory of the nature. They don't know how to respond to this glory, so it is a kind of a response to this glory. So it is getting this reflection in the city. You have the technology, you have the context. So afterwards, you create the monster. And science fiction and urban has another link. The person can achieve or realize itself within the urban areas, within the cities. We also talked about that before. We are expert in some aspects, in some subjects, and we complement them with other expertise. So there is a sort of alienation, and there is a distortion that we get from a guitar sound, for example. So it is that kind of a link. So science fiction and its link with the city has different segments. One of them is about narration, it's about decoration or actors, the characters, right? It is a narrative link, and another link is about what happens in the city. It's about events, for example, disasters. It's about difficult regimes, dystopias, for example, the people or the streets under control, and all the flux of different events and people, limited people, surveillance, for example. But this is very inspiring. Frankenstein could only happen in a city because it is an urban event, right? Because they had the laboratory, the scientists, they were in the cities, but the creation could not be, that creature could not be put inside the city. So it was not meaningful. So he had to get out of the city. So you said something also very important. You do not want to have a disaster within the city because it is a center of different events. It is a very fragile place, the city. For example, the invasion from outsiders, earthquake, and atomic bomb. So you cannot resist to that. It is also true for the rural areas. But if you want to stand on your feet, if you want to be self-sufficient, in cities, you cannot stand alone. If there is a zombie attack, for example, it is better that you are out of the city. Or if there is an alien invasion, you cannot stand in the cities.
Muhtemelen daha dayanıklı bir yapım.
The speaker is not speaking to the microphone. So in terms of construction, there are rural movies. We talk to them and we ask him why rural areas, and he said, what is your expectation? He made a very reverse comment and he said, I want to narrate a person's story and it doesn't matter to me where that person lives. actually, it is not a very proper answer, if it's proper to say. Maybe you criticize me for that, but rural areas, when we say rural areas, we think about problem, poverty, lack of possibilities. Kara Osmanoğlu, for example, a famous Turkish writer, we think about pressure, right? And the science fiction and its link to the city can be considered within this concept. For example, the novel theory of Barthes. What differs novel from poems or other narrations is the power of integrating all different types of writings within the same type of literature. So we can see a lot of discourses here, a lot of different narrations. So it is about the success of being able to gather all these different types of literature. So in any city, for example, Leidener draws a very nice city portrait to us. There are also very bad, rusty areas of cities, and also other hacking events in different parts of the city. So there is a pyramid in the city. He gives us a multi-layered dimension of the city. It is also existing in the cinema, in the movies. We can keep all the narrations together, and strategically speaking, you gather all these narratives because you make a fiction out of that. This story can only be narrated within this city. You cannot find any other decoration or any other environment. For example, can you give an example of that? Blade Runner is an important example of that. And in this city and the narration, they are together and they cannot be separated. In cyberpunk style, it is more prominent. So these characters, these actors can only exist in that city. Altered Carbon, for example. There are also other examples of that. And social cultural organization within the city is also reflected in the architecture and also the living style of the city. You have lower level, you have upper level also, you have a hierarchy, and the city is narrated according to that. Ursula Le Guin, for example, in her literature we also have the same. So we have many other different examples, but we only have one hour. For example, the unpossessed. We have two different ideologies, two different states in Ursula Le Guin's literature. So we have Anaris and Uras. And one of them is reflecting the capitalist system of the world in Dispossessed. And in the other one, we see anarchy, classless, without any class. The language spoken is very different than the language that we understand. It's also constructed in a different way. So we are talking about two different planets. And it's about the tension between these planets and also the borders. Şebek, for example, one of the characters, mentioned that the walls, they were transparent to us, they were unexisting. So in a city, you have to think about this, a city that you convert into that city in a while. So a person who lives in Istanbul, for example, or a person who is living in a rural area, these two people, they have a totally different a kind of mood and style. it is a megapolis, but it's an individualistic structure. We have a mass containing different levels. There is no union. I'm not talking about some totalitarian structure. We have a huge city in Istanbul. There is no a comparison between these two parts of the city. So in the science fiction, it's the same thing. We have multi voices, but there is also cacophonia. You give us this structure in Istanbul about the science fiction in Istanbul. There are some narrations or some literature, piece of literature within this concept.
İster istemez tek sesli kalıyor. Yani çünkü burada
because in the Western world, they have a lot of criticisms, but we do not make this criticism for our literature in science fiction in the cities, because and somehow they can analyze their situation in a better way. So it's a very healthy criticism. So regardless of the class, we cannot make this criticism. Our narration, on the other hand, is about white Turkish people, and it is really pathetic in this era because we have a lot of subcultures, sub-societies, and we do not see them. And the science fiction in our society, we get exposed to many different pressures from outside. So we need some higher quality literature, and it will take a lot of time.
Ya İstanbul'la devam etmeden önce biraz
Before going into detail to Istanbul, I have another question about new romance. I am really interested in this. Neuromancer and cyberpunk. Starting from the beginning, they are about cities, and they are getting the cities into the heart of the narration. It's about the events. It's beyond the environment, the decoration. So could you make comments on neo-romance within this regard? Because there is another city beyond that. There are some virtual cities, right? There is a spatial fiction. The emergence of cyberpunk is a product of the development of technology, narcotism. They are all in parallel. There are a lot of elements of that. You change yourself with regard to identity. You create something. But there is also a creation within you through the city. You are not using horses, for example, anymore. There are towers. You get into a technological cycle, or you get behind and you get isolated. And for neuromesh, we see the privatization of this individualization. You can, for example, create artificial livers, and then you then you create a vicious circle in the long run. And we see the enterprises and the monopoly of enterprises. For example, the artificial intelligence development can give us the same example, because the monopoly of enterprises create a benefit of that, and there is a new book, Techno-Feudalism, named Techno-Feudalism. It is talking about techno-feudal world, and the most important factor is the following: the rent is the most important thing in feudal technical world. It's not. It's very different from the capitalist world. So there is a cliche world aspect: the towers, sky towers, and also advertisements all around. And the individual is not very vividly depicted. There are a lot of different types of people living together. So all the urban violence can occur in these places, right? This is the end of it, and this is the lesson that we have to take. Cyberpunk. I'm talking about the city of cyberpunk. Yeah, and we are also supporting them. For example, sky towers and also sparkling mediatic places. And they are really appreciated by the majority of the people. Actually, high buildings, they, the people want to live in these places. They want to reach these places. Yeah, but 95 years ago, when they started emerging in the United States, these high towers, Wright, actually, the name of the architect, there was a matter of aesthetics. There was a kind of a coherence. But now in our society, it has nothing to do with that. It's about benefit. It's about revenue, because it's about making people live in a very small places, in these buildings and high towers. I cannot hear the speaker. There are a lot of people living in the same spaces, in the same building, but what kind of fantasies, what kind of expectations, we have to talk about them. And also there is a high crisis of housing. For example, a neighborhood called Esenyurt. Esenyurt is actually another city within Istanbul. We have plenty of time. However, we need to talk about the main topic. Shadow Above Us. It is an urban novel, and beyond the novel, we have different stories. There is a street, and the main figure moves from Istanbul to Eskişehir, which can happen to any of us, and it says, I was getting used to Eskişehir, and it was okay. I went to Istanbul a couple of times, and I established a small Istanbul in Eskişehir. All the everything, the news, everything that we did was like in Istanbul. So I was getting bored again. So it was a kind of an apocalypse, right? Yes, a micro apocalypse, we can call it. In this book, we have a big picture. We have a big event there. It starts in Istanbul, like in Frankenstein, right? If we look at from a retrospectively, but we want a distance. We need this tranquility. And we also need to take, we need to create a totally different environment. So we have to take it to different places. But there is a luggage, there is a big bag from Istanbul. There is no silent corner in Istanbul. There are a lot of shadows, right? There is no this silent space, a silent street in Istanbul. So for the first time in my life, I have seen the end of the city. There were towers, and there were also slums in Kaya Şehir. It is called Kaya Şehir. And I said, this is the end of Istanbul. There is a movie called Dark City. and it is also depicted in this movie. You see a silent place. You feel comfortable in there. However, in Istanbul, this figure is moving from Istanbul to Eskişehir, and I wanted to create a better and more comfortable space for this character because it was a very modest person, and he also wanted to create another Istanbul in Eskişehir, which is 2.5 train way from Istanbul, and it was repeating this reality again in another city. That's all. That's all that I want to say. But there are a lot of fiction happening in Istanbul. Kutluhan Kutlu with Aslı Tohumcu, Istanbul from 1999. And they talk about Istanbul of 2099. It was published in 2020s, and
Yani kıyamete 5 kalaymış.
So, actually, Istanbul is already in such a futuristic situation. For example, think about what we call the Channel Istanbul. So, Istanbul is already a fantastic city. So, the cities in that science fiction collection do not really shock us. We are not shocked. We are already living that, By the way, yeah, of course, we should be shocked. We should be alienated. We should give a reaction because, people say science fiction is not about the future. Science fiction is about our actual day. So that's how we should read the stories, commentators say. And because science fiction basically allow us to think about the current order. The science fiction stories are here to alienate us from the current situation so that we can take a more critical look. But in this collection called Istanbul 2099, I mean, people are feeding on medication, drugs, there are new inventions, whatever. But beyond that, the transformations concerning the cities make you think, this is already what's happening. We are living in such a futuristic Istanbul. By the way, stories are great. But I agree with what Cihan is saying because the time is so fast. It's a bit like the Black Mirror. I'm sorry, I just interrupted you, but yeah, think about Matrix. There's this interview with Keanu Reeves asking him if inside and outside is the same, why should you try to leave the inside area? Yeah, I mean, in a period shorter than a generation, the city has been transformed completely. Yeah, but the problem here is something that we see in world literature as well. Well, 20 years ago, people said, "Is poetry dead?" And now we are saying, "Are novels dead?" No, they're not dead, but they are basically being transformed. So we have this writer called Saul Bellow, and he has a great novel of Chicago, basically a story of self-realization, self-actualization. So basically, how the author is, how the character is being involved. But in Turkey, we really have very rare such stories. For example, Yaşar Kemal's İnce Mehmet novel is one such example of the transformation of an individual. But we know how this story ends. So Istanbul doesn't really allow people to actualize themselves, realize themselves. You are not supposed to act as an individual. You are not supposed to create your own world. So the masses don't really have the chance to act in a creative manner. So if we can't tell the self-actualization story of a single individual, how can we do the same thing for the masses, for the wider society? Let me share with you a striking example. So you think about the film E.T., right? So Spielberg's E.T., what's the story? There is an alien, the poor alien has a shuttle, but unfortunately it falls on the garage of a family, and it enters into a connection with a kid. But the family decides to hide the creature, and the relationship between the child and the ET is very interesting. And in Turkey, by the way, in Turkish cinema, we immediately we adapt the international films to Turkey. Like, for example, we had a Turkish version of Exorcist, a Turkish version of ET. So we are very responsive in this sense. And so in the Turkish version of ET, so we have this alien which falls into a neighborhood in Istanbul. But what happens is, they are not hiding the alien. Suddenly, the alien becomes the most popular character in the neighborhood. I don't know. That alien goes to the school, becomes a friend with the local kids, whatever. Yeah, the ET is a very interesting example, because ET is basically a film which passes in a suburban area, but when it happens in Istanbul, where we don't have a proper American suburban context, things are totally different. Yeah, for example, in the real ET, there is no connection between the shopkeepers and the alien. They try to hide it from the police, etc. But in the Turkish version, things are totally different. So apparently, the original ET version doesn't fit into the Turkish urban texture. Okay, an alien has dropped into your house. That's not dramatic, apparently, for Turkish people. Maybe some people would have stoned the alien. Yeah, that would have been interesting. I think she's speaking about an example where, like in a story, a cyborg was stoned by Turkish locals. Something very interesting has happened. That's exactly what I wanted to say. Let's have an interactive session. Let's ask questions and, continue the session in a more interactive manner. And not only questions, comments, your take on the matter. I have participated in this seminar during the Ottoman period. We can't hear her, but whatever. So there is this. In the Ottoman period, there was a total different look about monsters, dragons. In Europe, for example, people who were physically different, marginal, were showcased in festivals. But in the Ottoman context, that was different. For example, these physically challenged individuals had the chance to gain their economic independence. Society tried to make sure that they could survive as individuals. Yeah, maybe, yeah. We are telling, these physical challenged people, these so-called aliens, that, you can live with us. This expresses a desire that everyone has. You were just speaking without a microphone? Wow, your voice is so strong. Yeah. Maybe we shouldn't go into that angle. Should I say what I'm thinking about? No. Yeah, okay. Antagonism, so conflict. Evil. Maybe in Christian metaphysics, I don't know, evil is something that comes from within the individual, but in our culture, it's something which is supposed to come from the outside. The devil comes and hoodwinks you somehow, swindles you. So, the fight between good and evil. It's an individual experience in Europe, maybe, but in Turkey, it's something different, because so evil isn't a part of the individual's internal dynamics. Evil is something that comes into you from the outside. Maybe in the film E.T., there was no case of evil, but in this world, your actions can have a negative or a positive impact on life. For example, why are we reading ancient Greece still? Because they speak about, individuals have hubris, but individuals also have arete. So they have a force which leads them towards evil, but also a force which leads them towards the good. So we are still looking for these forces. That individual, that character takes decisions, and the story is basically us looking at how that individual is experiencing the results of these decisions. So in E.T., for example, in the Turkish ET, let's say, I mean, there isn't a single individual who is engaged with ET, but a whole neighborhood. So there is no tragedy in our Turkish version of the ET film. It's a more social situation. But then there is another challenge. I find this very important. So when we speak about science fiction, we tend to think about dark films. But, like 2 years ago, there was this series called Station 11. It has been adapted from a novel. So there's a pandemic and people are killed, but we see a parallel fiction. So we see what's happening before the pandemic and after the pandemic. But, okay, people's lives are ruined, but for example, we watch a group of people who set up a theater company. So everything doesn't have to be so drastic, so dark. So there are lots of examples of this across the world. And we should also, so science fiction also invites us to think about this. So this is the case not only in Turkey, but across the world. We see people who are, we see this dichotomy between misfits and people having a lot of fun. But losers or very happy people. But there has to be a midpoint between these, right? I mean, we have very funny films or things which are very tragic, dramatic. Maybe we have to strike a balance between these two, create something new. For example, in Istanbul, science fiction films, there are huge high-rise buildings. People are, people are being killed, whatever. But it doesn't have to be like that. So if we focus on genres such as science fiction and horror, I mean, in Turkey, unfortunately, we cannot really deliver good science fiction. I mean, many of our science fiction films are basically parodies. Because to do a good science fiction film, you need money, you need budget. For example, the Turkish film Kutsal Damacana, a comedy film in Turkey, a relatively popular film, is obviously cheaper. It has a smaller budget. Somewhere, I think you have written, all horror films in Turkey are shot on the Princess Islands in Istanbul. So it's as if there is no connection between horror and Istanbul per se. Yeah, I mean, in one horror film, for example, there's a film called The Wedding of the Zombies. It's not, science fiction per se. Once again, they're on the Princess Islands. By the way, I'm going to give a spoiler, but you can watch it on YouTube. I don't know, you might plug your ears if you don't want to hear this. So it is morning, and one of the characters was saved, so she isn't killed. She's on the Princess Islands. She's looking towards the city, and there are fires across the city. Zombies have invaded Istanbul. So you cannot escape anywhere. So the islands are ruined. The city is ruined. But I mean, if I were to shoot a horror film, I would do the same thing. I would shoot it on the islands because it's horrible. I mean, you can very easily turn it into something horrible. I mean, it also has a gothic touch, right? Well, in Istanbul, in the city, somehow, different lives are a bit more compartmentalized. So, for example, we don't have something like the God City, the Brazilian film. So, for example, we are living in a rampant inflation, but people are going crazy. Somehow they survive, right? So, okay, I'm not going to dwell into this because, I mean, this is not our theme, but you cannot show the city, so you focus on the Princess Islands. Yeah, a recent example, for example, I think it was a nice job, but the Netflix only allowed for a single season the Turkish TV called Sıcak Kafalar. For example, we saw a dystopian Istanbul there. People are setting up barricades, there are conflicts, etc. But Istanbul really can turn into this. I mean, I had the same feeling when I was reading the stories in the collection Istanbul 2099. I wasn't shocked by that. I mean, something like that can happen in Istanbul. That's feasible. Thank you. Many thanks. Well, you were speaking about Gothic. Gothic can be interpreted in a different way. We have lots of Gothic, stories set in rural areas, not in city, for example. there are lots of discussions around this. Science fiction, cyberpunk. Do we have similar examples? Of course, this is a genre which was born in a city, but do we have, for example, science? Do you think there's a tendency towards maybe science fiction set in rural areas or cyberpunk set in rural areas? I don't know about such a film in the context of cyberpunk, but cyberpunk is associated with a city. So the detechnologization of nature, whatever. So I think this is something that people are thinking about in the context of natural catastrophes. Well, yeah, okay. I think there are such stories. So in Hollywood, people really like that. It's a great way of destroying cities. There is this film which is called The Day After Tomorrow. It has a huge budget, and there's the huge demolition of cities. Then there's this interesting novel. I don't know if it responds to Richard Powers has a novel called Over Story. It hasn't been translated in Turkish. It's like 900 pages, and there are like 9 parallel stories. So in that novel, I mean, it's like it's set on 9 different trees. I mean, some of these trees are virtual, some of these are real trees. In one story, you focus on a single leaf, and then in another story, a scientist is trying to keep alive a tree, whatever. I'm not going to give any spoilers, but I think this novel has elements of cyberpunk. So yeah, okay. We tend to associate cyberpunk with technology, but this novel shows us that nature can have its own cyberpunk. It's a great novel. It's a great novel. I think we only have 5 minutes. A last question. I mean, I have a last question, but I think the audience might also have questions. I don't know if we have time. We have 15 minutes. I mean, would the organizers allow it? Would they shut the door on us, maybe? No. Well, okay, then let's give the mic to the audience. If no one else wants to speak, can I speak? As the others are preparing their questions, I think you can go ahead. Well, if you allow me, I just was assessing what you've said. What kind of relation? I was thinking about relationship between urban space and science fiction. So science fiction and fantasy can be distinguished very easily as genres. So if there are dragons, if there are magical portals, that's fantasy as a genre. Or if there is teleportation, there are flying cars, that's science fiction. I mean, that's the kind of distinction I would make. But there is one important issue beyond this. Science fiction, how does science fiction handle horror? So in fantasy there are more individual horrors, but in science fiction I think there is social horror. So think about the emergence of industrial revolution, which has sparked science fiction, because industrial society has introduced people to speed and has inspired a lot of fear in people. So technological fear, fear of alienation, maybe xenophobia was born then, I don't know. So I think social fear has an impact on science fiction. When city is an object of fear, so think about George Simmel's text on cities, alienation, too many stimuli, these distance people from their identities. These have a negative impact on individuals. So this is a sociological perspective, and I think we can say the same thing for science fiction. So city becomes a space of fear, horror. So since then, I mean, from then until now, whatever inspires fear in us, I think we see its reflections in science fiction. So I don't know, if we are afraid of pandemics, if we are afraid of nuclear war, if we are afraid of disasters, we see it in science fiction. The digital revolution, you were speaking, maybe Neuromancer can be considered to be the beginning of cyberpunk, but I think it also represents fear towards the digital revolution, because digital revolution is, transforming us as individuals into data. So what's going to happen to our spirit? I think that's one element of it. Yeah, I mean, this is a vast issue of discussion. For example, when photography was invented, people were afraid that photographs would capture their spirits. I think it's the same thing with the digital revolution. Okay, so we printed our images on photographs. We were afraid of that, and now we are asking ourselves whether, as individuals, we can be translated into numbers, and what will happen to our spirits. I mean, science fiction and fantasy, how can we distinguish them? The main distinction is, I'm not going into technology or abnormal developments. Yeah, okay, that can be associated with science fiction, but I think the basic distinction is, in the fantasy genre, I mean, we tend to say everything was great in the past, and let's keep it that way. But in science fiction, we tend to say things aren't going. Things cannot continue this way. How can we imagine something different? Actually, fantasy is a regressive, conservative genre. But I mean, good written fantasy is great, obviously. But for example, think about Game of Thrones. In the Game of Thrones, why does it function as a good story? Because beyond the wall, beyond the northern wall, we have the wildlings, and the dragons are kept within the eggs. As soon as the dragons go out of the eggs and the wildlings go beyond the wall, obviously the story collapses. Because good fantasy has its own fissures in itself, but science fiction gives you an idea about how things can evolve and how we can go towards something more interesting. So you were speaking about horror, so I think we shouldn't demarcate horror and passion with very thick lines, because things that inspire fear in us can also appeal to our fantasies, appeal to our passions. Maybe these are things that we want to experience and get rid of. I mean, in fiction, but also in real life. Well, this city has been the object. Isn't always the object of fear in science fiction. For example, from Asimov to Herbert, city. Not city as we know it, but I mean science fiction city is also the object of hope. It also harbors hope. Yeah, it's only in that way that it can, it can become an object of expectation. We expect something from the city, but it turns out to be something else. So there is an illusory aspect to it. So we can say the same thing for the house, right? Why are horror films set in houses? It's a great setting for houses, because house is supposed to be the area where you are supposed to be very secure, but it's precisely because of this that you experience the most horrible fear in house. So a friend of mine had this experience of fear. I mean, he was studying and he wakes up this way and his arm is like that, and he sees his hand and he's afraid of his own hand, and he suddenly falls off the bed, right? I had never heard of something like this. I mean, a nightmare. I think the strongest fear is our fear of the unknown. Yeah, but I mean, yeah, the fear of the unknown, but also an appetite or a curiosity towards the unknown. So these two tend to merge, maybe, or the tension between these two. That's what pushes the story forward, right? So we are afraid of it, but we are also curious about it. And some of them take action, some of them take a step back. Otherwise, there wouldn't be no life, there wouldn't be no films. Do we have a couple of more minutes? Yeah, sure. Feel free. Hello. I'm curious, are you interested in digital games, video games? Because in science fiction games, what do you think about the city as represented in science fiction games? Because unlike the case in, films or novels, in video games, you experience city. In an RPG game, you, walk across stroll through the city, you actually feel the experience. And so the city is represented in a different manner, I think, in video games. What's your take on it? So this is a theoretical question, but I'm curious to know if you are playing video games. Well, I don't play video games. I do, but I mean, the answer to this question is very comprehensive, but I mean, to put it briefly, well, Baldur's Gate 3 is a fantasy role-playing game. The second example is Placecap Torment, another role-playing game. It's not science fiction, but it's something between science fiction and fantasy. 3 years ago, Disco Elysium was released. It's an alternative universe, set in an alternative universe. There are science fiction elements, as you say, but there are also... So the video game developers are Estonian. You know, they focused on the Iron Curtain experience of Estonia. So, you know, in a video game, you basically travel to uncharted territory. You go to places that you couldn't travel before. So this is the taste that the video game gives you, but also actually it has a great connection with the city. I mean, I'm expert in certain issues. I'm not an expert in other things. So when going into certain neighborhoods of the city, I need a magician with me. I need a fighter with me. I don't know. I need a paladin with me, whatever. A knight. So, yeah, exactly. I mean, it fits perfectly because you cannot, you know, deal with all the problems in a city alone. So, and in a good game, that's how you experience it. You can, you know, explore a city with these people who are accompanying you. So I think it gives us lots of interesting clues about establishing a healthy relationship with a city. Well, I have a question about experience. I'm thinking about the relationship between individuals and virtual architecture. I carry out academic work, academic studies, and also I work on concrete projects about this. And science fiction really nurtures me because the imagination of science fiction is very inspirational. So, as you have said, in this 12th century novel, you know, people used to focus on learning, on understanding, and then with the onset of cinema, our senses were activated. I mean, think about the future when we are going to start wearing, you know, wearable technologies. I think we will, you know, step into new horizons. So the transition from novel to cinema is a whole new evolution. But maybe in the future will we experience a more immersive science fiction? Do you have such examples? You know, wearable technologies, whatever. Are we going to step into that kind of a revolution? I don't agree about what you said about the evolution from novel to cinema. This book can be as immersive as a film. So I think cinema, novels, literature, I mean, yeah, there isn't such a hierarchical relationship. So the first stage was novel and cinema is a higher stage. No, I don't think that argument. I couldn't focus on the rest of the question. You know, I was totally focused on the first issue. Well, that's how I think. Well, so we are like, you know, running after the Western civilization, right? I mean, and so that's why we focus on vision, seeing. And so, for example, do you have an image? Do you have a picture, a photo? So we attribute a lot of importance to the Western civilization, which focus totally on vision, seeing. And if we go to a more immersive experience, I think people will appreciate it. Seeing, is it that important in Western civilization? I think it's much more general. It's something evolutionary. Yeah, but I mean, for Western civilization, I mean, knowing is seeing. So I believe in what I see. Huh? In Turkey, for example, we focus on internal seeing, you know, spiritual seeing. By the way, you know, the visual media, you know, in the past, you know, novels were published in chapters, like on newspapers, right? And for example, what you would do is you would stop the story at its most exciting point, and then you would invite the readers to buy the next issue of the newspaper. I think that's the same strategy that we see in TV series, whatever. So, yeah, it's quite hard to predict. So we might think that a genre is about to go extinct, but then it can, you know, totally renew itself. For example, In the past, we used to think that, I don't know, video game is only about violence. But now, I mean, if you were to say something like that, people would really beat you up, because there are such video games that, for example, you can experience, you try to, I don't know, take an old woman from A to B during the Ice Age in Japan, whatever. I mean, 15 years ago, there wouldn't be no such things. So the Unity, the video game motor is now accessible to everyone, and people are very creative. So, well, if you try to copy whatever is shown to you, I mean, you cannot really make a lot of progress. We should ask ourselves, what can we do differently? Be it wearable, be it unwearable, I don't know. Well, then there's another discussion. We say that, cinemas are over. So movie theaters are open. Every day we discuss this, but now we have Oppenheimer, Barbie as new films. For example, last year we had the launch of Dune. Well, visually speaking, these are films that you have to see in a movie theater with IMAX technology, whatever. You cannot see it on TV. You cannot watch it on your telephone. You wouldn't have the same experience. You wouldn't have such an immersive experience. So, but maybe the same thing was true in the beginning of cinema. For example, there were, cinemas with odors, scents. So there were different methods of physically engaging the viewer, different methods. And now, so we have IMAX. So we have, for example, moving seats, whatever. Yeah. I mean, it would give me nausea. Any questions? No. I hadn't thought about any of this, so this is a great discussion. Well, Istanbul. Istanbul is a very rapidly changing city. And so it really inspires horror and fear in you. I have a total different experience of Istanbul. For someone who is 10 years older than me, there was a total different experience, whatever. So every year, maybe every 10 years, Istanbul is changing. And as you have just said, this change maybe doesn't allow us to individualize, but you basically surrender to that individualization. So you feel exactly that fragmentation of Istanbul within you. Yeah, for example, when I stroll through Istanbul, I really want to have certain superpowers. You think that you cannot deal with Istanbul without those superpowers? Maybe teleportation would have been handy. It is a city which really triggers you, and probably as a culture we have always had a very weak relationship with science. Yeah, we tend to have a very narrow perspective. We think in a very narrow way. For example, I don't know. For example, if the pandemic strikes back, many people in the services sector, they will die first, right? Because they have to go out. We experienced this in the pandemic. Yeah, we were sorry about it, but we followed it up. For example, such a thing can happen. And maybe we won't be able to find individual solutions to this, but all of this provides you a lot of material to write about science fiction. But when something about the pandemic was written, you never take the perspective of a service sector employee who has had to walk during the pandemic on the streets. For example, think about a science fiction story about a relationship between Turks and Syrian migrants. So we only have very, one-dimensional reactions. We don't take a more delicate, multi-dimensional perspective. Because what you call alienation is something that really creates an upheaval. It's very political. And when you do a good example of alienation, you can really get into trouble. For example, in Istanbul 2099, there was this story. It really, it was horrible. I was shocked. I don't really know whether it was a great story, but there was this individual called Chairman who is 130 years old. It was horrible, I think. I simply hope that nothing like that would happen, like a president, a chairman who is 130 years old. That's a real great collection of stories. So, what's the name of the story? The Barber of the Chairman, the Barber of the President. Any other questions, comments? Yeah, I think we are now back to the beginning of the conversation. I want to ask something about Istanbul. There is this book called The Big Chaos about climate change. The author says implicitly, I mean, ecological crises is something that we have always seen in science fiction. So, and he underlines the convincing power of narration, and he shares this 30-minute story that he has experienced in Mumbai. And he says that, you know, he couldn't really present this as a real story. No one would believe it, but we can only discuss it maybe in science fiction. Maybe that's what we're seeing in Istanbul. The mic is exploded. So maybe that's what we're experiencing in Istanbul. So there are multiple layers in the city. If you were to give all of these details, if you were to be a bit more courageous, I mean, would the story be realistic if you apply so many layers, one on top of the other? It is. I mean, Istanbul itself is very fantastic. I mean, how more fantastic can it become? Ryder Jones. I mean, there was. It's not Easy Rider, something else, something Rider. It's a post-apocalyptic story. It's written in such an English that, you know, basically a new English has been bred after the apocalypse. So you can understand the novel only if you use your internal voice to understand English. Obviously, it cannot be translated into Turkish, for example. That's what you made me think of. You can understand that English only if you read it internally. So English has been manipulated after the apocalypse. Don't look up. For example, that's not a science fiction movie. It's horrible, isn't it? It's something that we experience every day. It's really weird. By the way, for Neuromancer, I mean, it was said that it cannot be translated. Well, you translated it. How did you do it?
Şimdi daha yüksek. Yani artık dermatolog dediğin zaman yani 10 yaşındaki çocuk bile bunun deriyle ilgili olduğunu tahmin edebiliyor. Yani bundan 30 yıl önce öyle değildi. Ama benim bir de şöyle bir avantajım oldu. Türkçede de teknoloji daha çok konuşulur oldu. Burası teknoloji biraz olsun. Her zaman çok istediğim yönlerde olmasa bile teknoloji üretilir bir yer oldu. O da dile yansıyor ister istemez. Bir de çevirmen olarak da biraz uğraşmanız gerekiyor, yani acele etmemeniz gerekiyor.
Okurken de galiba.
Evet.
Acele etmemek gerekiyordu.
Evet, ama yine de işte yani Türkçe ile İngilizcenin temel farkı şu, işte o özne nesne yüklem, özne yüklem nesne. Neuromancer'da da bunu maalesef o sonlardaki boşlukları bırakırken çok zorluyor. Türkçe'de bunu muğlak bırakmak insanı çok zorluyor. Neyse, konuyu dağıtmayayım. Oralarda çok zorlandım tabii ki yani. O yüzden de kolay olmuyor okuması da.
Peki.
Bir şey söylemek istiyorum ben.
Buyurun.
Bu hani İstanbul çok fantastik. Hani daha ne kadar hani bu çağın bilim kurgusundan bahsedebilir miyiz yani? Şimdi Can'ın senaryosunu yazdığım bir film, değil mi?
Evet.
Son çıkış mı?
Evet efendim.
Son çıkış. Orhan Pamuk'un meşhur pasajı vardır ya, işte Boğaz'ın suları çekilse altından neler çıkardı.
Hala Türkiye'de yazılmış en iyi bilim kurgu öyküsü bence.
Değil mi?
Evet, kesin yani.
Yani çok bir yani işte parşömen gibi işte üst üste katmanlar. Siz de ona benzer bir şey yaptınız galiba, değil mi? Boğaz'dan mı çıkıyor? O biraz spoiler ver artık onunla
Yok,
ilgili.
şöyle, son çıkış 2018 yılında gösterime girdi. 2016, ben 2014'te yazdım ama aslında yazmaya 2012'de başlamıştım. 2012'de yazmaya başladığım şey, 2023 yılında Büyük İstanbul depreminden 6 ay sonra geçen bir post apokaliptik bilim kurguydu. Ama biz yazmaya çalışırken bir noktada işler prodüksiyon açısından çok büyüyünce, bir de Alman ortak yapımcımız vardı. O dedi ki, ya zaten İstanbul şu anda distopya. Sen niye bunu illa post apokaliptik yazmaya çalışıyorsun ki? Otur, öyle yazın bunu. Günümüzde çekin dedi. Yani zaten yaşadığınız şehri görmüyor musunuz dedi yani.
Para
Biz de
yok.
hakikaten de zaten para da bulamadığımız gerçeğiyle yüzleşince bilim kurgu hikayesi oldu distopya. Biz ama şöyle bir şey yaptık. Karakteri bir şekilde İstanbul'un bu hale gelmesini sağlayan bir mimar Ama ilk defa o yarattığı şehrin içine düşüyor. Normalde her şey transit geçerken hep bizim gündelik hayatında yaptığı gibi bu sefer transit geçemiyor. Ara yollara düşmek zorunda kalıyor. Biz de bu İstanbul'u yönetmenle, görsel görüntü yönetmeniyle ve location scout'la tabii ki bir amalgam yarattık. Yani işte Kayakent, Kayaşehir, Fikirtepe, Merdivenköy, Yenibosna, İkitelli her taraftan
Frankenstein yaptınız
bayağı
yani.
gerçekten öyle yaptık. Yani bir İstanbul görüyorsunuz ama neresi olduğunu, oraları özellikle gidip gelmiyorsanız kestirmeniz çok zor. Hem kentsel dönüşüm olan yerler var, hem kötü durumda olan yerler var. Ve bizim karakterimiz zaten işte bu yarattığımız amalgam içinde kayboldu aslında, yani öyle bir durumdu.
Kentsel dönüşüm acayip Kafkacı bir şey değil mi? Kentsel dönüşüm. Yani işte böceğe dönüş. Yani bir sabah uyandığında İstanbul kendini
Evet.
Frankenstein gibi buldu yani. Galiba artık bitiriyoruz.
Kim özür dilerim, sadece bir şey ekledim. Cihan Hoca'nın şeyi manasında, demin bir konuşma esnasında
Mikrofon,
sesin geliyor mu?
mikrofonu uzatacağız.
Fantastik ve bilim kurgu arasında bir ayrım yaparken şöyle bir açıklama yapmışız. Bir ara İstanbul'un tanıtımında metrodan çıkan atıyla beraber Sultan bir tanıtım filmi vardı. İstanbul daha böyle, ben yabancı Erasmus öğrencileriyle çok takıldığım için İstanbul için fantastik kelimesini, amazing kelimesini çok kullanıyorlar. Köşeyi dönüyorum 1500'den kalan bir bina, köşeyi dönüyorum gökdelen. Onun için gerçekten geldiği Avrupa'daki şehir bağlamında inanılmaz bir şey. Ya modern bir şehirden geliyor ya kasabadan, taşradan bir yerden geliyor. Şimdi hani bilim kurguda kent dediğimiz şeyde, mesela siz demin o bahsettiğiniz senaryoda şeyleri derken bir öğrenci bana şey demişti. Haydarpaşa'dan vapurla geçerken o vinç taşıyıcıları için İstanbul'un bekçileri demişti. Kendi dünyasında bir fantezi dünyası yaratmış ve İstanbul'da böyle roller biçmiş. Araçlara da bir roller biçmiş. Biz bundan sonraki süreçte siz hani Cihan Hanım şey dediniz ya, adalar için korkuyor. Hani şimdi set yaratmak bilim kurguda gerçekten pahalı bir iş ya. O yüzden şehirleri kullanıyoruz artık. Ama İstanbul'da bir şekilde Smart City diye adlandırdığımız biz konseptin içine girmek zorunda. Hani Esenyurt'u beğenmiyoruz ama Beylikdüzü var, Smart City. Ataşehir var, Smart City. Bilim kurguda bu Smart City bir şekilde şehirlerde oluşacak mı, oluşmayacak mı? Siz dediniz ya başta konuşmanızın bir yerinde. Hani yazarlarda da, senaryo yazarlarında da artık bir tıkanma var, bir yer bulmak zorundalar.
Ya bilmiyorum, ulaşır kehanet olarak mı? Evet.
Bir yandan amazing bir adlandırdıkları fantastik stil, halen öyle bir algı var İstanbul'da.
Ya İstanbul çok zor bir şehir değil mi? Ya içinde dolaşması, yani şehirde bir yerden bir yere gitmek.
Güzel olan da bu.
Ama çok kolay olabilirdi. Ama çok zor yani. Bugün mesela izdiham vardı. Metrobüs diye bir şey var. Evet. Aman Allah'ım, yani kalabalık kontrolünden bir haberiz. Herkes hadi hınca hınç. Yani izdiham, ölürsün.
Öncesinde de 500T vardı. Halen var gerçi.
500T değil mi? O da fantastik, aynen.
Çok daha kontrollü bir paket halindeydi.
Evet.
O öyle bir, yani karşılaştırılamaz.
Hani insan ölçeğinde yapılmamış burası. İçinde insan yaşaması birincil hassasiyet değilmiş herhalde diyeceğim yani. Kaldırım, ya bilmiyorum, neyse, bir şehir planlamacılar var. Niye böyle yaptınız? Ben size soruyorum.
Benim kafamda ciddi anlamda, özür dilerim zamanınızı alıyorum.
Estağfurullah.
Ciddi anlamda son dönem bu bir kendi düşüncemde bilim kurguda bir eksen kaymasının olduğunu düşünüyorum. Çünkü hani Blade Runner'la başladınız. İkincisi 2049'da felaket üzerine kurgulanmış bizim bilim kurgu.
Evet.
Yani o bir ekspans üzerine kurgulanmıştı aslında. Yani evet, science fiction, kurgu, yeni bir düzen, şu bu falan filan, ama yeni dönem yapılan bilim kurgu dizilerinin çoğunda mesela bu Silo'yu en son seyretti. Bir disaster var. Kapanıyor insanlar bir tünelin içerisine. Ya da bir trende geçiyor, snorkel'si falan filan. Alanın tamamen dışındayım ama gözlemlerim üzerinden baktığımda insanların bir yerlere tıkalı. Onun içerisinde bir düzen kurulur.
Bizi alıştırmak istiyorlar değil mi aslında?
Yani bu Vogue falan filan derken geldiğimiz pandemiyle biraz bu. Kimseye ilgili bir macera arama. Yani,
yolculuğa çıkılmıyor artık değil mi? Bir yere tıkılıp kalıyor.
Ölüyor yani, macellanlar ölüyor falan filan. İnsanın geldiği noktadan gittiğimiz noktaya. Yani, o yüzden fantezi mi daha ağır kaçıyor acaba bilim kurguda artık insanlar?
Ya hep yorumlar ona bağlandı. Bugün yani İstanbul ve bilim kurgu olmuyor, İstanbul ve korku oluyor, İstanbul ve fantastik oluyor
Yok,
ama
olacak.
bilim kurgusal bir şey çıkmıyor.
Yok, kesinlikle olacak belki ama bazı şeyleri değerlendirmemiz lazım yani.
Peki şimdi dükkanı kapatmamız lazım. En azından formal olarak son söz. Yani böyle bir aslında son sorumuz şeydi. Yani bilim kurgu aslında kent dediğimiz şeyi biraz aşmamızda yol gösterici olabilir mi? İşte Neuromancer'dan çok bahsettik. Aslında sanal bir kent de var burada. Sadece Neuromancer değil, bütün cyberpunkların içinde böyle bir takım örnekler bulabiliyoruz. Bir gezegeni kaplayan kentler var aslında. Yani böyle kent kır ayrımı diye bir şeyden bahsedemediğimiz durumlar var. Ama dükkanı da kapatıyoruz. Ben sadece böyle bunu ortaya atmış olayım ama giderken ne demek istersiniz deyip...
Ya ben şunu söylemek isterim.
Hakan Altun, şehri terk ediyorum.
Yok. Onu da söylemek yok. Ben İstanbul'u çok seviyorum da. Şimdi T.S. Eliot'ın bir sözü var ya, dünya bir patlamayla değil bir mırıltıyla yok olup gidecek diye. Bence iyi bilim kurgu kentle ilişkisine dair de bir şey sunmak istiyorsa o patlama anı değil, illa apokaliptik sonrası, post apokaliptik değil, kıyamet zamanı değil, tam da o arada bulunan zamanlar üzerine bir şeyler yazmaya çalışmamız, okumaya çalışmamız, bunlar varsa onların üzerine eğilmemiz gerekiyor. Çünkü tıpkı şey gibi işte bu felaket gazeteciliği gibi işte iklim konusunda olan bilim kurguda da benzer bir şey var bence. Biraz da ara dönemlerde neyi nasıl güncelleyebileceğimize, kurtarabileceğimize bakmak kentle olan ilişkimizi daha sağlıklı hale getirir gibi geliyor. En azından sadece hepimiz birer hilti kullanmayı öğrenmemizi yol açacaksak bile.
O da olur.
Artık bunun üstünde ben bir şey
Tamam. Peki o zaman herkese çok teşekkür ederiz.
Teşekkür ederiz.
Bu oturumu tasarlarken böyle bir akademik bir şey olmasın, bir eğitim olmasın istedik. Bolca kitap geçirdik. Aslında amacımızı da öyle belirledik. Yani dinleyiciler buradan çıkınca bir kitapçıya uğrasınlar. Bolca zikrettiğimiz tepemizdeki gölge de dahil olsun adına. Kitaplardan birine bir bakınız efendim. Zaten bakıyorsanız da
Teşekkürler. Çok teşekkür ederiz size de. Çok sağ olun.